Welcome to Novara Live, 3 days after Americans went to the polls and just over 2 days since we knew that Donald Trump has won the presidency for the second time. Now, you might be thinking, why are you still talking about this? We're a UK-based podcast. Well, two reasons. What happens in America matters in the rest of the world, both in terms of foreign policy, especially in terms of climate change. And also, this was a massive election. We can learn so much from what happened, lessons which can be implemented in the UK or wherever you're watching. And I have two big hitters today. Later in the show, I'll be joined by my colleague, Aaron Bastani. For the first part of the show, I'm joined by CEO and Editor-in-Chief of Zeteo, Mehdi Hasan. Mehdi, thank you so much for joining us again on Novara Media.
Good to see you, Michael.
As I say, you've had a couple of days to absorb what's happened. This is fairly momentous. It can seem sort of ordinary. Of course, Trump won, he's a bit rude, but what can you do? Looking at this in historic perspective, this is a big deal, right? We shouldn't really underplay what's just happened.
Oh, it's huge. Most people did not see it coming, including, I assume, the Trump campaign. It's not that he won, but he's won a landslide in the Electoral College. He won the popular vote, which he's never done before. And in fact, no Republican, with the exception of George W. Bush in 2004, has pulled off since 1988. So Republicans have not been very good at winning the popular vote. They've always been considered to be a kind of minority party, which we never really talk about. Their policies are unpopular according to every poll. And yet here he is, a disgraced ex-president, twice impeached, criminally convicted, found liable for sexual abuse, closed his campaign talking about people eating cats and dogs and Arnold Palmer's penis, and wins a majority of the popular vote and in the Electoral College. It's earth-shattering just in terms of the result itself and what it says about campaigning, messaging, political and news media, a lot of things to learn about that, but also what's going to happen now, the impact on the United States. This is an openly authoritarian, racist president, and the impact on the world. We've already seen it today, where Netanyahu has just swapped his ambassador out to Washington, D.C. He's appointed a settler, a Kahanist, a West Bank annexationist as the new Israeli ambassador to the United States. So, just sticking with foreign policy, Donald Trump just had a call with Zelensky, which apparently Elon Musk was on as well. So a lot going on in the world.
Let's go on to what a Trump presidency or what a second Trump presidency will mean in the second half of our conversation. Let's stick for a while on sort of your assessment of why the Democrats lost. You said they're sort of Trump authoritarian, racist. I mean, lots of people are looking at the results and saying, actually, he's done better with minority voters. Maybe it's time to sort of shelve this idea of demonizing the guy as a racist and talk about something else, I suppose, talk about bread and butter issues. I mean, how would you respond to that?
It's a couple of things. Number one, I've never understood this argument that if you have a black friend, it means you're not a racist. I judge people's racism based on what they say and do, not on who supports them or likes them or gives them a pass. I don't care if every black and brown voter in America voted for Donald Trump. That doesn't change the fact that he ran on a campaign that was racist towards his opponent, racist towards migrants, racist towards all sorts of people. This guy was saying migrants are poisoning the blood of the country, straight from Mein Kampf. If you don't call that racist, I don't know what you call racist. So I've just never bought this argument that, if more minorities support you, it means it's fine. That's just not how the world works. And you know what? It turns out that a lot of minorities can internalize bigotry as well. You're seeing a lot of reporting now from Latino communities who are saying, well, he's not against us. He's just against the illegal folks and the criminals. Well, guess what? He's going to be after all of you. He's going to be after all of us. There's a story in the Austin American-Statesman today, Michael, from Texas, where they interviewed undocumented Mexicans in a Home Depot parking lot saying they supported Trump because they thought there were too many undocumented Venezuelans coming in and competing for work in the parking lot. So like there's no group of people that can't fall for the divide and rule, can't fall for turning on one another when the right demagogue does it. And in terms of the bread and butter, look, why can't we walk and chew gum? I never understood why you can't talk about the threat to democracy and the rise of racism and fascism, but also talk about the need for an ambitious economic platform as part of the battle against racism and fascism. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the greatest anti-fascist president in American history. He was the guy who laid out the Economic and Social Bill of Rights. He was the guy who said the best way to defeat fascism is put food in people's stomachs. So I don't see why you can't walk and chew gum. I think we have to be able to do both. I think Bernie Sanders has come out very strongly saying this was about the economy. I think the economy played a big role. But you can't just make it about the economy because we know, for example, The FT in the UK has done fantastic research yesterday. I'm not sure if you've seen it. 120 years of elections they looked at. 120 years, going back to 1905. And they found that this is the first year, 2024, where every government in a major democracy which went to the polls either lost power or lost seats or lost votes. Right, every single country in the world. In the UK, Rishi Sunak wiped out. In France, Macron loses in parliament. In India, Modi loses his majority. In South Korea, go through the list. Left, right, Europe, non-Europe. It's happening everywhere. So clearly there was a massive anti-incumbency headwind that Harris and the Democrats were running against at the presidential level. You'll notice that the Senate candidates amongst the Democrats outperformed Harris. The policy initiatives to raise the minimum wage, to protect abortion rights, which were voted on in states like Missouri and Montana, they did really well. So we have to be careful about kind of making sweeping judgments based on the presidential election in this post-pandemic year.
Well, so, I mean, some of the Senate candidates didn't outperform Kamala Harris, did they? I keep seeing Matt Iglesias and Noah Smith sort of saying, sort of two centrist pundits saying that actually Kamala outperformed Bernie Sanders, and so who is he to give election advice?
Yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders in Vermont is irrelevant. I'm talking about if you look at the swing states. In Michigan, for example,
where it's competitive,
she lost Michigan, but Alyssa Slotkin, a centrist ex-CIA agent, won the Senate race in Michigan for the Democrats. So you have to stop and think about that. The other extreme is the other reverse example. You go to Missouri, and I'm obsessed with this example. Voters went to the polls in Missouri, red state Missouri, and they voted to raise the minimum wage and they voted to protect abortion rights. Those same voters then moved that paper, picked up another paper, and voted for Donald Trump and Josh Hawley. Insanity, I think, but that is how Americans are treating these elections. Winston Churchill famously said the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with a voter. I feel like that after looking at some of these skewed results. But look, I think the anti-incumbency thing was a real thing. I think the inflation pain of 2022 was real. Our mutual friend Owen Jones and I were having a conversation on our podcast, Too Outspoken, yesterday here in DC. We were arguing a bit back and forth. Have real wages improved or not? I think they have. He thinks they haven't. I think the economic data was better than it was made out to be. I think people in this country are very misinformed. Ipsos Mori did a poll, Michael, a few weeks ago that showed people who believe that crime is up, inflation is up, and border crossings are up, none of which are true, by the way, are more likely to vote Republican. And people who don't believe that, which is the truth, are more likely to vote Democrat. I think we have to deal with the information environment that we're in, that a lot of people just have no clue what's going on. And so they're easily lied to.
So I haven't looked at the crime statistics. I was under the impression that border crossings had gone up for the 4 years that Biden was president compared to the 4 years that Trump was president.
Over the 4 years, inflation is up cumulatively 20%. Border crossing, agreed. I'm talking about right now, though. The Biden administration has done its job in terms of bringing down inflation to 2%. Border crossings are lower today than they were when Donald Trump left office. Real wages are higher today than when Donald Trump left office. People don't know this stuff. This is a real problem, right? We live in a country where people are getting their news from TikTok or whatever it is, and there's a huge misinformation crisis. That's just a reality.
Is there not a danger, though? Because I accept what you're saying, and I think what the Biden administration would say is that, on a technical level, they haven't done a bad job when it comes to the economy. They ran the economy hot. That was actually quite good for low earners. It's the most
successful economy in the Western world, whether you like it or not.
They were reasonable economic managers, I think, probably, right? But when people sort of say they're worse off, there's a difference between did the Biden administration do something wrong on the economy and were people actually poorer or just feeling poorer. Now, obviously, to me, it seems reasonable for a voter to say, I'm not going to judge you based on what's happened this year, the inflation rate this year. I'm going to judge you on the inflation level over the past 4 years. And I'd say the same with border crossings, right? I'm not going to judge you on the border crossings this year. I'm going to judge you on border crossings over the past 4 years. So is there not a danger that you're... Michael. Go on, sorry.
I agree it's reasonable. 100% I agree it's reasonable. What I think is unreasonable is to say, I got hurt by inflation, assuming voters vote on policy, and I actually don't think voters vote on policy. But let's say there's a vote who goes on the vote, oh, inflation, that's my issue. I've got to reject Joe Biden. But then you're pulling the lever for Donald Trump, who's going to jack up inflation big time with tariffs. Like every economist in the world agrees that. Now, again, do people know that? Do people know what tariffs are? Has it been explained to them? Have they been lied to and told that the foreign government will pay for the tariffs? I mean, some of this stuff has to be worked out. Trump is a very lucky man, Michael. We have to talk about luck in politics. He inherited a great economy from Obama, ran with it and said, I'm a great economic president. He then pretended his presidency ended in 2019 and washed his hands of 2020 when 500,000 Americans died and unemployment was in the tens of millions. So, he's very lucky. Biden comes in, like most Democratic presidents, has to fix the mess he inherits. does fix the mess. I mean, what he did is pretty unprecedented in modern American history. He managed to produce a soft landing. He managed to break inflation, bring it down to 2% without jacking up unemployment, which is what most governments left and right have done for decades, right? We have 4% unemployment right now and 2% inflation and the highest growth in the G7. He did all that. And of course, nobody gives credit. That's fine. But the reality is Donald Trump now comes in. And I tell you, Michael, January 20th, 2025, Trump will be sworn in. I'll make you a bet right now. He will start bragging about how strong the economy is. And people will believe him.
Yeah, I suppose it's just this distinction, isn't it? Are people mistaken to think they've been terrible managers of the economy? Maybe. Are people mistaken to think that actually they have been
pain, yes.
in their pockets?
They had pain.
No,
but then what do you do?
They didn't imagine the economic difficulties.
No, I agree. They had pain in 2022, clearly. There was record inflation. But it was global. Inflation in the UK, where you are, was higher. Canada was higher. France was higher. Germany, Turkey was 20%. You're not going to win that argument. That argument was lost. So there's two things. One is the argument the Biden people tried to make and failed was it's a global supply chain issue, which it was, but they lost that argument. The separate argument is one that my former colleague Ryan Grimm made to me on our show this week, which was they should have taken inflation and run with it against inflation and against price gouges. And they should have run a left populist campaign in 2022 to say, yes, you're hurting. Yes, inflation's bad. Blame these guys. Blame the meat companies who have jacked up your prices. Blame all of these people. Greedflation was a real thing, and the White House went out of their way to play it down. That was a huge mistake in hindsight.
Let's talk about what's going to happen next. It's different in America, isn't it? Because I'm used to sort of a general election here. The first sort of couple of days after the result comes in are really, really busy. They're appointing their cabinet. They're doing loads of speeches. It feels a bit odd looking at this because I'm waiting. When's Donald Trump going to say something? When are we going to get an announcement? You do get a bit of a quiet period. What have we learned, though, in the past couple of days about how Donald Trump will govern?
So we've learned that it's going to be as bad as some of us said it would be, and probably worse. We've learned that Donald Trump's a liar, and all of the some of the progressives and some of my fellow Muslim Americans who fell for his bullshit about being the peace candidate, anti-war dude was a lie, as some of us warned it would be. We've seen it in the first 72 hours. Just take two topics right now. Take Middle East. Netanyahu has appointed a Kahanist far-right settler to be the new Israeli ambassador to DC. He's done that for one very good reason, because he's going to annex the West Bank with Donald Trump's permission, maybe encouragement, right? That's number one. Trump is about to appoint David Friedman, his former ambassador, who's also an annexationist, to ambassador to Israel. He's also appointed Brian Hook, who was a neocon in his first administration, is a long-standing DC Iran hawk, to run the State Department transition team. He's floated Marco Rubio and Mike Pompeo to be his Secretary of State, both long-standing neoconservative hawks. So all this bullshit that Trump is MAGA, America first, isolationist, maybe Trump will be less hawkish than Harris, bullshit, right? It's very clear that the direction of travel in the Middle East. And then you go to, for example, the world of workers. Trump is now the Workers' Party. He won a majority of people earning under 100K. Well, good luck to those folks, because in the first few days, they're already briefing the media that they're going to come in very quick, very hard with a tax cut policy for the rich, deregulation for the rich. Elon Musk is going to get his reward. This is not going to be a workers' party in any shape or form.
And what do you think the Democrats are going to learn from this election? What direction do you see the party going in response to this defeat?
So when I was traveling around some swing states talking a lot to Muslim and Arab Americans, actually, in August and September and October, a lot of people said to me, we need to punish the Democrats for Gaza. And I get that. Gaza was horrific and Democrats were complicit in it. Complicit in it. But what they would say to me is we need to punish them. And when we punish them, and when we make her lose Michigan, we will have leverage. The Democrats will be forced to listen to us. And what I said to them was, I wish that were the case, but that's not how politics works, sadly. There's never been a case in my lifetime, and you know this from the UK with the Labour Party, where a centre-left party loses an election and goes, man, we weren't left-wing enough. It just doesn't happen. They always tack to the right, with the exception of Jeremy Corbyn, and we saw what happened with Jeremy Corbyn. But look at it, and we're seeing that already, Michael. You mentioned earlier, Matt Iglesias and others. You're seeing centrist pundits immediately come out saying, we were too woke. Defund the police, even though no one's campaigned on defund the police for 4 years. Kamala Harris listened too much to the left. The Washington Post ran a headline, Michael, saying, stinging verdict for the left. What are you talking about? Harris ran a centrist campaign. She promised to put Republicans in her cabinet. She campaigned with Liz Cheney more than she campaigned with any Democrat. She bragged about owning a gun. She talked about the importance of a lethal military. She had Mark Cuban as a proxy. She ran a centrist campaign. She lost for various reasons, not just the campaign. But now the Democrats will say, and I guarantee you they're already saying it, this country is a right-wing country. We need to move to the right. We need to forget about all the stuff about transgender rights, gay rights, minorities. We need to crack down on immigration, et cetera, et cetera.
I've got to let you go in a moment, and I'm going to talk about this with Aaron in a bit, but I do think it is sort of worth pointing out that something which I think confounds people on the left is that Donald Trump was seen as more of a moderate than Kamala Harris.
Yes.
So whether or not sort of from our perspective, we'd say she run a centrist campaign, it does seem that Kamala Harris was more to the left of the American public than Donald Trump was to the right.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to do kind of sweeping things because, for example, on foreign policy, Donald Trump was seen on the left. Right? That's how he very cleverly, because they left the lane wide open for him, he turned up in Michigan and did rallies with Arab Americans going, I'm the peace candidate. I'm going to protect Muslims. Liz Cheney's a warmonger. Like, he played the lefty anti-war card beautifully in the last 10 days of the campaign, completely fraudulently. And just like he cosplays everything, he pretends to be anti-big business and the side of the little guy. He pretends to be anti-war. Now, there's one issue is he's a liar, and it's outrageous how much he lies. But the other issue is how come the Democrats let him get away with it? They leave these lanes open for him, right? The economic populist lane, the anti-war lane. And I fear they're going to do that again going forward because they're going to learn the wrong lessons from this election and say we need to be much more right-wing. When, you know what? Look, people don't vote for the diet version of a policy. They vote for the real thing.
Mehdi Hasan, I know it's been an incredibly busy week for you, so we're very, very appreciative of your time. Always great to get your thoughts and your insights.
Thanks, Michael.
We will, for the rest of the show, be speaking about lots of these issues. Again, I'm going to be talking about sort of some of the analysis, some of the data I found most interesting in the days following the election. And I'm going to be talking about that with my erstwhile colleague, Aaron Bastani. Let's get straight into some of the data points that I found sort of most interesting. 3 days after the US election, recriminations and competing explanations are still flying around on and offline. These were some of the arguments, as I say, that I think have been most prompt the most interesting thoughts. Let's say that's always my my criteria for what is allowed onto the show. This is an article in The Atlantic which spoke to Biden advisors to get a sense of what they thought Harris had done wrong. This was very interesting. Harris began the campaign portraying Trump as a stooge of corporate interests and touted herself as a relentless scourge of big business. During the Democratic National Convention, speaker after speaker inveighed against Trump's oligarchical allegiances. AOC of New York bellowed, "We have to help her win because we know that Donald Trump would sell this country for $1 if it meant lining his own pockets and greasing the palms of his Wall Street friends." They go on. While Harris was stuck defending the Biden economy and hobbled by lingering anger over inflation, attacking big business allowed her to go on the offense. Then, quite suddenly, the strain of populism disappeared. One Biden aide told me that Harris steered away from such hard-edged messaging at the urging of her brother-in-law, Tony West, Uber's chief legal officer. You can't make this stuff up. They say West did not immediately respond to a request for comment. To win the support of CEOs, Harris jettisoned a strong argument that deflected attention from one of her weakest issues. So she was a populist until she talked to her brother-in-law, who was Uber's chief legal officer. She never did seem like someone with particularly strong convictions. As I say, I think that does sound convincing. That seems like a big error from Harris and her campaign. I do also think that it is probably the case that whatever Harris had said, it would have been difficult to overcome people's concerns about the economy. Stephen showed you this chart on yesterday's show. Mehdi Hasan mentioned it in our interview, but it is worth coming back to because I do think it is so significant. It shows that for the first time ever around the world, every governing party facing re-election in a developed country this year lost vote share. And you can actually see that relative to other countries or relative to other incumbent parties, we can say the Democrats actually did quite well. So they were facing very difficult headwinds. They didn't do too badly. Maybe if they'd tweaked the messaging, they could have done a little bit better and got over the line. To me, it seems like, as I say, difficult headwinds they were facing. Of course, the common thread in all of these countries, the one thing that is the same in all of them, not quite the same, but a common problem in all of them, is inflation. Defenders of Biden's economic program will argue that alongside inflation, the American economy also had strong jobs growth. That's true. They'll also argue that by the time of the election, inflation was under control. That's also true. But this chart shows why the party still faced such a challenge. So you can see here real average incomes. You can see they steadily rose under Trump. There was a sort of big spike when people's pandemic checks arrived. Then after Biden gets into power, it spikes again because there's another wave of government checks. And then this is what really killed them, right? In 2022, incomes sort of completely collapse because of inflation. In part, that was sort of the post-COVID inflation, sort of supply shocks, let's say, and it was also the war in Ukraine, which sort of screwed everyone, as Mehdi Hasan said, including Rishi Sunak in this country. Given inflation was very much a global phenomenon, it's not clear how the Democrats could have avoided the fate of incumbents everywhere else. They would have had to have done something quite special. But the further evidence that electorates really do hate inflation has sparked a debate among economists. Noah Smith, I talked about him with Mehdi, is one of the most influential centrist economists on Substack. So he's written a piece saying that because Americans hate inflation more than they hate unemployment, Biden's economic policy should have been less progressive. He argues that Biden's COVID rescue plan was too big and that a less expansionary fiscal policy would have been a better option because it would have been less inflationary. He admits this might have caused more unemployment, as a sort of contractionary fiscal policy would do, and he admits that that would hit the most vulnerable, but he says that would only have affected a small group of voters, whereas inflation hits everyone. So for political purposes, it was still a mistake. So he says this: some progressive economics commentators consistently downplayed the risks of inflation and extolled the many benefits of full employment during Biden's tenure in office. In retrospect, whether or not this was a good move from a moral standpoint, it looks like a big mistake from an electoral standpoint. Full employment is great, all things equal, but sometimes the price of full employment is too high, not just for the majority of Americans who have to endure years of erosion in their purchasing power, but for everyone who has to suffer from the election of leaders like Donald Trump. There is, though, it's important to say, an alternative argument from some economists on the left, principally here, and sort of most significantly, is economics professor Isabella Weber. She tweeted this: yes, inflation decided this election, as many progressive economists have warned since 2021. No, inflation was not due to too much government spending. It was induced by global shocks. The context here is that back in 2021, Weber had proposed her own response to inflation. She'd argued that just as in World War II, or just as after World War II, when the inflationary shock after that war hit, governments introduced price controls. Economists argued for price control. She said we should have done the same thing again. She's a German economist and works in America, but German, so has also been commenting on upcoming elections in Germany, where the centre-left incumbents look set to lose. She said, can we finally have a serious conversation about anti-fascist economics? So not just talking about economics as sort of a technocratic thing, but how do we deploy economics, I suppose, to stop the rise of the far right? Aaron Bastani, I want to bring you in at this point. We've got so much to sort of talk through, so much to digest. Can I get you to begin with this question on sort of inflation, the economy, what analysis you've been impressed by over the past couple of days, what analysis you haven't been convinced by?
So I suppose one place where you and I depart a little bit, Michael, although I do agree with a significant amount of what you're saying and thinking, is that I think the Democrats could have got this over the line, actually, if they make a bunch of different political decisions, if they just operationalize a much better campaign, which they failed to do. I think they have a weak candidate with a lack of a propositional offer, and they fight a really weak campaign. Now, when I say a propositional offer, you think I'm talking about economic populism. I wouldn't even go that far. I just think substantively there was so little there. And if we talk about really the last 4 years with Biden, consider this. The CHIPS Act, which, by the way, as a piece of industrial policy, is really key for American competition with China and maintaining global technological leadership. The CHIPS Act is costing $272 billion US. It creates 36,300 jobs. That is $7.5 million a job. Now, if you were just doing classic pork barrel politics, Michael, in swing states, I think you probably could have made a real dent into the margin of victory that Donald Trump just had. And I think that's also a really interesting question. Because of the challenge of China, a technocratic Biden presidency has sought to implement an industrial strategy, industrial policy of a kind the country really hasn't seen in 40, 50 years plus. In terms of the long-term US national interest, that's pretty obvious as to why they've done that. But actually, in terms of short-term electoral calculus, doesn't make a dent, right? You're spending $272 billion to create a little more than 30,000 jobs, right? Now, try and wind that down for a UK context. Of course, our population is what? About a fifth the size of the US. So the equivalent would be creating 7,000 jobs for more than $50 billion. I don't think that would make much sense to any UK politician. So I think that's something to really dwell on. And then just on the numbers, the margins of victory here. Pennsylvania, it's 135,000. Michigan, 80,000. Wisconsin, 30,000. Incredible, 120,000 votes here. Let's say that you run a centrist campaign. I wouldn't want you to do that, but let's say you run an effective centrist campaign. What does that look like? You probably would have picked Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, as your VP, rather than Tim Walz, who's from Minnesota, who you are not going to lose ever as a Democrat, right? So that wins you Pennsylvania. Now, of course, he's a very pro-Israel, very strong Zionist politician, Josh Shapiro. So you'd have to think about how do you win those votes in Wisconsin and Michigan if that means you win Pennsylvania. By the way, I think it probably would, right? At which point you're presented with a challenge as a centrist, which is what Kamala Harris is. How do I win 80,000 votes in Michigan and 30,000 votes in Wisconsin? And I don't think that's like some existential challenge, actually, Michael. And I do think it did boil down to the fact that the Democratic Party establishment is just not as ruthless with people like Donald Trump and the Republican Party as they are with their own left. There are real parallels with the Labour Party in this country too. And I have to say as well, as somebody who's criticised Keir Starmer and Labour many, many times, they operationalised a much more effective, impressive campaign in the British general election in July than the Democrats just did. Right? Doesn't mean I'm a fan of Keir Starmer either. So I do think we can have the argument about ideology, about policy, about inflation, all really fascinating arguments, really interesting and important arguments. But I also just think that if they ran a better, more professional, more effective, non-stupid bullshit campaign, they also would have won. There's a line from Clive Woodward when he was talking about the England rugby team and ahead of 2003, when they won, of course, the Rugby World Cup. Hugely impressive accomplishment. And he said that you can never improve something 100%. You can improve 100 things 1%. And I think that should have been the mindset here. Had the Democratic campaign improved 100 things 1%, if they'd, really played for those inches, as Al Pacino says, in any given Sunday, then Kamala Harris would be in the White House. So there are two separate debates there, right? But I would like to push back on that idea that, Kamala Harris never could have won. It was impossible because of her policy agenda. And also, just quickly to finish, picking up on something that Mehdi said, Biden did win 81 million votes in 2000 in response to Trump. So the idea that a bold industrial policy, front and center, pushing the idea of a protective state, the idea that is anathema to the median voter, I do not agree with that. And actually, they're two sides of the same coin, right? You talk about the state playing a more decisive role in industrial policy. It can protect citizens. Trump's doing the exact same thing with regards to the borders and migration. He's saying the state will protect you. It's a different policy area. It comes with a bunch of different subtexts. But fundamentally, the point is the same. Authority, power, the state will protect you. We'll keep your job. We'll keep down inflation. We'll make sure your standard of living is good. We'll make sure crime is low, that you're safe. And fundamentally, I don't see why, I'm not talking specifics about migration or crime or whatever, but I don't see why that rhetoric should belong to the Republican Party any more than the Democratic Party or the Conservative Party any more than the Labour Party.
I mean, I suppose where I differ from you on this, or where I would push back a bit, is I think you are just overstating the significance of messaging. Now, if you look at the types of people who are switching, between the Republicans and the Democrats. So people often sort of go to a Trump rally and they say, well, these people at the Trump rally were really annoyed about Cheney, which means, I know it's a great video. We put it out on Novara Media. Say sort of these Trump voters don't like Dick Cheney, therefore it was stupid for Kamala Harris to come out with Liz Cheney, right? I think that's misunderstanding who are the types of people who are switching between parties here, right? People who are really hyper engaged in politics tend to already know who they support. If you're hyper engaged in politics, you're probably not sitting on the fence between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The people who are switching, I think, are people who are low information voters. Now that can sound insulting. I'm not saying they're low information people, but they're the kind of people who aren't following politics very closely, which maybe, frankly, all of us should do less of. I don't know, that wouldn't be good for my job, but there we are. But these are people who aren't necessarily going to be focusing too much on the messaging of the different parties. And people say sort of, oh, it's only 1%. So it wouldn't have to be many people listening to these messages and taking them on board. Well, you've got to think the 1% you've got to win over are the people who are on the fence. So they're not the kind of people who are really obsessively watching political TV, right? They're the people who it's probably fairly hard to reach anyway. Then you've got for them to see that message and believe it. Now, I think for Kamala Harris to have come out with, I don't think there's that many messages. At least, I don't think there's any sort of economic populist message which she could have come out with that would have been particularly convincing. And actually, it was very difficult for her to not just have I'm the continuity candidate, given the amount of time she had and the fact that she was the vice president for Biden. Also, she was a shit candidate, right? She couldn't give an interview for more than 10 minutes and sound remotely convincing. She wasn't a good candidate. I think if they'd picked a completely different candidate a year ago, then maybe they could have had some sort of distinction between Biden. But I don't think any single message that Kamala Harris put out would have been convincing enough to persuade a bunch of fairly low information voters that she was radically different from Joe Biden, and whatever message she put out, not only did they pay attention to, not only were they convinced by, but they thought it overrode all of their other concerns. To me, it seems somewhat implausible. I would love to have Aaron push back, but I feel like his camera might have just died. Is that what's happened there, Gary? I think Aaron's camera has just died. Maybe we'll come back to this in a moment. For now, shall I talk about the next part that we're doing while we get Aaron back online? The economy was undoubtedly the biggest issue in this election. Lots of the discourse following Trump's win, though, has focused on something which is sort of funner to debate, whether the Democrats are too woke. This contribution from Democratic strategist Julie Rodzinski has clocked 10 million views on Twitter.
I'm going to speak some hard truths to my friends in the Democratic Party. This is not Joe Biden's fault. It's not Kamala Harris's fault. It's not Barack Obama's fault. It is the fault of the Democratic Party in not knowing how to communicate effectively to voters. We are not the party of common sense, which is what the message that voters sent to us. For a number of reasons. We don't know how to speak to voters. When we address Latino, and language has meaning. When we address Latino voters as Latinx, for instance, because that's the politically correct thing to do. It makes them think that we don't even live on the same planet as they do. When we are too afraid to say that, hey, college kids, if you're trashing a campus at Columbia University because you're unhappy about some sort of policy and you're taking over a university, and you're trashing it and preventing other students from learning, that is unacceptable. But we're so worried about alienating one or another cohort in our coalition that we don't know what to say when normal people look at that and say, wait a second, I send my kids to college so they can learn, not so that they can burn buildings and trash lawns, right? And so on and so forth. When we put pronouns after names and say she, her, as opposed to saying, you know what, if I call you by the wrong pronoun, call me out, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. But stop with the virtue signaling and just speak to people like they're normal. There's nothing I'm going to say to Michael that I'm not going to say to you, that I'm not going to say to somebody else. I speak the same language to everybody. But that's not what Democrats do. We constantly try to parse out different ways of speaking to different cohorts because our focus groups or our polling shows that so-and-so appeals to such and such. That's not how normal people think. It's not common sense. And we need to start being the party of common sense again. Joe Biden is not responsible for that. Neither is Kamala Harris. It is a problem that Democrats have had for years. I've been banging the drum on this for, I don't know how, probably 10 years, if not longer on this. We need to get back to being the party of common sense, that people look at us and say, we understand you. We appreciate what you say because you speak our language. And until we do that, We should stop blaming other people for our own mistakes.
No, I think, as I say, one of the reasons why I think wokeness sort of gets focused on is because it is more interesting to talk about on the television than the fact that probably, I think, inflation just made it very, very difficult for any incumbent to do very well. I think, the Democrats would have had to have run a remarkable campaign to overcome that difficulty. They clearly didn't. But that doesn't mean that everything that was said there was completely ridiculous. I do think that it probably is the case that the Democrats haven't been served particularly well by trying to appeal to each voter group based on their identity. And I do think it is interesting, actually, that, yes, Trump still is more popular among white people than he is among people of color. But it is the case that, actually, between this election and the last election, white people have basically supported Kamala Harris, similar to what they did last time. But people of color have moved to Donald Trump a bit, not massively. Among Latinos, it is quite large, but all groups have moved to Donald Trump. And it does seem to me the outrage that comes from, I suppose, university-educated people in left-wing circles isn't necessarily shared by the people who they're claiming to be outraged on behalf. And I do think that, that is something to potentially learn from. And I do think some commentators have also slipped into what I think have been bad habits from the past few years. Emma Vigeland from The Majority Report said this after the result: "Can't believe I actually had faith in other white women to choose our collective reproductive rights over their own whiteness. Naive and dumb." As I say, I think Vigeland's take is slightly at odds with what actually happened on Tuesday. So this is from Eric Levitz at Fox. Sorry, Vox, not Fox. He says, Harris actually won the same share of the white vote as Biden did in 2020, 43%, but her margin over Trump with black voters was 14 points lower than Biden's, while her advantage with Hispanic voters was 13 points smaller than the last Democratic nominee. So it seems sort of hard to say that this result was because people couldn't get over their own whiteness. Other commentators lashed out at men. Rebecca Solnit at The Guardian US said this: "Our mistake was to think we lived in a better country than we do." And she says, "Americans will be stuck cleaning up after MAGA's destructive streak because men like this never clean up after themselves." Now, I think both of those really are the kind of takes that blame and castigate voters on identity-based grounds. I don't think it's particularly helpful. I don't think it's done very well electorally. Let's look at a response, though, from someone who does think that the campaign was brilliant. And I do think this response on MSNBC should win the award for being the most out of touch.
I mean, this really was an historic, flawlessly run campaign. Queen Latifah never endorses anyone. She came out and endorsed. She had every prominent celebrity voice. She had the Taylor Swift, she had the Swifties, she had the Beehive. Like, you could not have run a better campaign in that short period of time. And I think that's still true.
She had the Swifties, she had the Beehive. Aaron, Queen Latifah backed Kamala Harris, and she never backs anyone. How did the American people not listen?
Well, it goes back to a point that Ash made the day following the election result. We had a live show here on Novara Media. And she said, look, this is just a complete failure of politics as fandom. And what you've got there in that final excerpt is somebody saying, well, she had all these fandoms. She had the Beehive. She had Queen Latifah. Oh, really? She had relatively wealthy celebrities who live on the coast. That's really a breakthrough for the Democrats. Well done. It makes me think of a Democrat ad for Biden in 2020, which really sums up how that was a much better campaign. And he is, looking at a Corvette. He's talking about his dad, what a great driver his dad was. He's wearing I think it was maybe like a Ralph Lauren polo shirt. He's wearing his Ray-Bans. He's coded as like a boomer floating voter, right? That's a good campaign. That's a good campaign. He's trying to appeal to people who might not necessarily vote for him. That's what a good campaign is, okay? This is just, that last one is just crazy. And there's so many different points I could talk about. The Rebecca Solnit article, by the way, was utterly disgusting. It's almost like these people are trying to antagonize and alienate as many people as humanly possible. But on that final one, it really does underscore what qualifies as a quote-unquote good campaign for these people. For instance, Kamala Harris should have gone on Joe Rogan. What was the downside? Okay, maybe 5% of his audience would have voted for her before. Okay, maybe that can be 10%, right? It's not going to get much lower, let's be honest. And by not going on, and by Trump going on, and by JD Vance going on, and by Elon Musk going on, it is the world's #1 podcast. That looks really, really bad. It looks like you're running away. It goes back to what we were talking about a few moments ago, which is that I'm saying she ran a poor campaign. You're saying she's a poor candidate. I think those two things go hand in hand. You know, in 2008, Barack Obama wins with an extraordinary campaign as an extraordinary candidate, as an anti-war candidate, by the way. It's the last time the Democrats ran an anti-war candidate. It's the last time the Democrats ran a candidate who wasn't the preferred choice of the Democratic Party establishment, because they wanted Hillary that year, remember? And he won, up until Biden in 2020, the largest number of votes in any presidential race ever. He won more votes in 2008 than Hillary won in 2016. Of course, the US has a bigger population in 2016. He ran an extraordinary race. Now, of course, a Democrat was always likely to win in 2008 because of the global financial crisis, because of this huge economic shock to the system, because of 8 years of Republican incumbency, right? Those would be all the normal talking points. But the scale of Obama's victory is down to an extraordinary candidate and an extraordinary campaign. So I would say, given inflation, given all these structural problems for the Democrats, yet they all exist, if you have an extraordinary candidate and an extraordinary campaign, you win. Simple as that. Now, going back to the Solnit article, where she's saying, oh, we didn't think about whiteness and how awful all these people are. Well, America can't be that bad, because Obama won this huge number of votes as a mixed heritage man in 2008. Now, I'm not suggesting America is post-race or there aren't racists in American politics and public life. Of course they are. But if a black guy can win in 2008, it seems rather weird that 16 years afterwards, you're saying that, whiteness is the determining factor in American politics. Some people it is, sure. Those people don't tend to vote Democrat anyway, historically. And it looks particularly weird when there is this dramatic shift amongst minorities towards the Republican Party, particularly Latinos. You know, we've had this talking point now for about 15 years where the Democrats, purely as a result of demographic change, are on the cusp of winning Texas. Well, it's not happening. It's not happening because people don't just vote this way or that on the basis of their skin color. And guess what? That's a good thing. I'll finish with this. I remember listening to the BBC coverage on the day of the election. I was saying this to Ash Sarkar. And this was when I got worried, Michael, is the BBC correspondent was saying she was at the Kamala Harris party, although Harris wasn't there at that time. She was having dinner with her family. And the BBC correspondent was saying, this is a historic campaign. There are little girls here. They're all dressed the same. And I'm thinking, she's saying the little girls, mixed heritage girls, all dressed the same. And I'm thinking, well, that's great. They can't vote. Okay? If you were telling me there's loads of people lining up to champion and argue for Kamala Harris, it's 65-year-old white boomer truck drivers wearing their trucker caps, I'd be saying, whoa, something is happening. Something is going on in America, which, by the way, was the vibe in 2008. That was the vibe. Those kinds of people were voting for Obama, and people were like, what on earth is going on? This is extraordinary. So talking about 10-year-old girls turning up at an election party, I was thinking, well, they can't vote. And guess what? If she loses, it ain't historic. There's nothing historic about it. So this self-mythologizing, which was really the bedrock of the Harris campaign, was what really got me concerned. And then you see the aftermath of it, and they're like, well, why didn't the self-mythologizing campaign win? Yeah, I wonder why. It's because you weren't actually talking about real people's grievances and what mattered to them, right? And of course, would that have won, Michael? I mean, look, we can have that conversation all day. But here's a really key thing, which we probably can agree on. It could have been a lot closer. And it is remarkable that Trump wins the popular vote, or he seems to be on course right now to win the popular vote. As Mehdi says, the first time Republicans done that since 2004. That is a huge indictment on the campaign that Kamala Harris and the Democrats just ran.
But when I say I think a better candidate could have won it, I think a better candidate who had been able to distance himself from Joe Biden. I do think sort of what John Byrne Murdoch sort of shows in that chart is just really quite powerful, right? Which is to say that actually for incumbents over the past year, the Democrats did quite well. It's just you have to be phenomenal to overcome that. Literally no one has, of left, of right, whatever sort of color government they got punished at the polls. And if the Democrats had replaced, well, it wouldn't have been Harris. And if they'd got a new candidate a year earlier who wasn't Harris, who wasn't in the White House, who could sort of run a campaign for a year rallying against price gougers or whatever, distancing themselves, then I think they maybe could have won because they wouldn't have suffered the same incumbency effect that Harris, I think, inevitably would have done, which is why, sort of in retrospect, she was a bad choice. I want to talk about this issue of sort of where the Democratic Party goes next. Obviously, as you saw from that clip, sort of there is a bit of a backlash against wokeness, and if the Democratic Party is too progressive on identity issues, I don't think that's why they lost the election. Right? I don't know how many. I probably shouldn't keep repeating myself. I obviously think it's for economic reasons that they did, but I do think that this will be a debate over the next 4 years, and people do need to be a bit real about it, right? This is from The Hill from back in September. The New York Times Siena poll out earlier this week revealed that only 32% of likely voters say Trump is too conservative. When asked if Trump was too conservative, not conservative enough, or not too far either way, 49% said he's not too far either way. So they think he's a sort of moderate in the middle, a bit like themselves probably. Asked about Harris, 47% of likely voters said they viewed her as too liberal or progressive. 9%, only 9% said not liberal or progressive enough. And 41% said not too far either way. Aaron, I've been quite active on. I normally don't tweet very much, but I was quite active the last couple of days because I kept seeing this completely false meme, which is people saying this wasn't about switches. This was that Kamala Harris didn't manage to motivate her base to go out to the polls. And the evidence people would use is that they say that both candidates lost votes between 2020 and 2024, which was based on a complete misunderstanding, right? Basically, someone had looked at the votes the day after the election, then looked at the final votes from 2024 and said, less people have voted this time round. That means the problem was enthusiasm. What they hadn't realized is that actually California takes ages to count votes. So in fact, it looks like turnout at this election will have been just as high, maybe slightly lower, but almost as high, the second highest in a century. This was not an election where people weren't motivated. People were motivated, they just chose the other guy. And so sort of that combined with this information does make me a bit skeptical of the argument you see from many on the left on social media, which is to say, if only you mobilize your base, if only you shift to the left and you don't disappoint people by making compromises, then you might do better. To me, there is a more, I suppose, there's something which might be less satisfying for us to sort of ponder when it comes to how one wins an election in a modern state.
So yeah, a few things, Michael, and I'm going to respond to what you just said, but also something you said earlier on, which is about, foreign policy doesn't really matter that much to many people, or, okay, yeah, some people voted Trump talking about foreign policy and forever wars, but it's not really that big a deal. Again, to remind you, the only Democratic candidate to win really big under normal conditions since Bill Clinton is Barack Obama, and he stood as an anti-war candidate, and he got a huge number of votes. So that stuff really does matter. And that's not to say that, if she'd just been more left-wing, everything would have been fine. But that actually is a hugely important political issue in American public life. It's partly why Obama managed to win the primary in the first place in 2008. It's why he got such a huge number of votes. It's partly why Trump wins the primary for the Republican nomination in 2016. He wasn't perceived as part of the permanent political class that wanted forever wars. This is a huge issue, right? And I'm not suggesting you're minimizing it, Michael, but I do also think that, that did not help Kamala Harris as a candidate. Now, that doesn't mean if she'd just been more left-wing, she would have won. I'm not suggesting that. But I do think that's a really salient policy issue, which, frankly, the Democratic Party establishment is deaf to. They don't think it exists, right? They didn't think it existed in 2008. They didn't get their choice as candidate. Obama blows away the Republican Party. In terms of, they should have just been more left-wing and then they would have won. There is a certain amount of truth to the fact, Michael, that, the Democrats just lost 10 million votes. And I suppose the question is, well, if they kept, I don't know, some very clever data person could do this. If they just kept nationally 2.5 million, maybe that would translate to the margins in these particular states. I don't know. Somebody clever can do that, right? So they lost 10 million votes. How many could they have afforded to lose and still win? I mean, that's a really interesting question, I think. And what would they have had to have done to keep those people voting for them? So I on the one hand, you said left cope on X. I get that point, but it's also still very much a live question. They lost 10 million votes.
I don't think they did lose 10 million votes, right? They haven't counted all the votes. So at the moment, Kamala Harris is on 69 million votes. Biden got 80 million votes, but they still haven't counted.
He got 81 million, no?
81, but they still haven't counted half of California.
No,
so
they have. California's now about 67%. You have a look. I looked at California's numbers earlier today.
According to the New York Times, it's at 58% right now.
Yeah, the BBC, I think, said a bit higher than that. And then you look at California's breakdown, it's 58% votes, and you look at the numbers involved, first of all, they're not going to win the popular vote, right? People are saying, she can still win the popular vote. That seems quite hard if you're looking at California. And a really interesting thing with California, Michael, let's stick on that for a moment, is that's Kamala Harris's home state, and the turnout for the Democrats is the vote rather for the Democrats in California is down on 4 years ago. I think that tells you something quite key in her home state, Michael. So that is about actually the base. That's the definition of the base not turning out. Your votes not turning out. Now the question is, what? Go on.
Well, I just think the reason I think the base not turning out argument doesn't work, right, is because
but they didn't turn out.
An election where the base doesn't turn out, the turnout has to go down. The turnout didn't go down, right? The turnout is the second highest it's been in a century. Now, I don't think the Democrats will end up having lost 10 million votes because I think it will go up. They will have lost some votes, but if you've got a high turnout...
They would have lost more than 5 million votes.
But if you've got a high turnout election, right, those people who weren't voting Democrat, they're the ones who switched to Donald Trump, right? There are probably about 25% of the public who are never going to vote. Right, so it seems to me way more likely that you had some switches from the Democrats to the Republicans than that there were some people who, for some reason, this election didn't feel motivated to turn out, but did in 2020. Right, so to me, if you've got a high turnout election and the Democrats' vote is down and the Republican vote is up, it seems likely to me that it's just that some people switched from Democrat to Republican, and that does have implications for what strategy would have been more successful.
Well, you're absolutely right on this, right? So we absolutely know from exit polls that a ton of votes, basically every voter demographic, bar one, I think, basically every voter demographic was more likely to tend towards Republican on 4 years ago. And so the Democrats failed to basically muster the same coalition. Okay, so let's rephrase this, because you're right. The Democrats failed to muster the same votes as they managed to muster 4 years ago. And that's really the basis of this conversation. And then we can talk about why, we can talk about inflation and foreign policy, blah, 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 right? Biden was never great on foreign policy. So it's kind of a point that, underpins what you're saying, really. But what I would say is, and I think this is key, and I think this is a really important point as well for the UK, Michael, it's hugely salient, is that we've basically seen the death of identity politics. And the idea that you can just count on certain voter demographics purely on the basis of the color of their skin, right? Latino men massively trending towards Donald Trump, and so I think you're right in terms of if they just managed to get those people who didn't turn out to vote for them. I think that is true for some people. Maybe we disagree. I think that is true, particularly in the states that they needed actually. But anyway,
well, the turnout was even higher in the states they needed. So like the turnout was higher than 2020 in those swing states mainly.
I think, but that's right. I think that's from some of the data I've seen, that's the turnout's higher because the Republicans managed to muster more people in rural counties. But anyway, park that. The fundamental problem, Michael, for the Democrats is that the coalition they've banked on, blue collar workers, minorities, has started to disintegrate. Bernie Sanders put it really well, right? In the day after that, he said the Democratic Party had walked away from working white Americans or white working Americans or white blue collar workers, and those voters walked away from them in 2016, and something similar has happened with minorities. And these are huge questions now to throw towards the people that run the Democratic Party, to throw towards people that are more amenable to identity politics in this country. I don't use that dismissively. I'm not saying that civil liberties, etc., equality under the law, these things don't matter. Of course they matter. I believe in those things. But this idea that because somebody is LGBT or because somebody is brown and black or because of somebody's gender or whatever, purely on the basis of that, they go, or their age, less so age really, but principally gender, race, sexuality, because of that, these people will always vote for you. I think that argument has died a death. That to me is the number one conclusion to take away from this election. And actually, we're quite fortunate in the UK in so much as our next general election is probably 4.5 years away, 4 years away. And we can learn that lesson really quickly. I think it's really dangerous territory to think that we're still in that world. And that to me is that's a decisive closure with like a really central part of the political culture of the 2010s. It was a really central part, right? People said, well, Obama won so big because the young and women and Latinos and black people, they all voted for him, and that's all the Democratic Party now needs to do. Well, it doesn't work anymore.
Someone in the comments is saying we're not arguing enough today. They want a big Barney like they saw last Friday. We have got one more clip for you, which maybe will provoke something. I don't know. The Republicans are going to control the Senate, and the House of Representatives is still to be decided. But it's very possible that the Republicans will have the trifectura, which is the presidency, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. It means they can pass lots of legislation. And on Fox News, the number 2 Republican in the House explained what Republican legislative, difficult to say that one, priorities would be.
Yeah, I've already talked to President Trump about this, a bill called budget reconciliation. And there are a lot of things you could put in that. We laid it out as a first 100-day agenda. And we would put things like renewing the Trump tax cuts, many of those which expire that we passed in 2017. We want to renew those cuts so that families don't see a tax increase. And President Trump on the campaign trail talked about some other things he wants to include there. We can include more American energy production. You want to talk, Lawrence, about getting our economy back on track. Let's open up more American energy that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris shut down. The ability to produce more energy in our country, it will lower costs for things like gasoline and food for families who are struggling. And it really takes leverage away from countries like Russia, like Iran, like Venezuela. So geopolitically has a lot of benefits too. Let's right-size government. Elon Musk is going to be very involved in that. We can put a lot of those ideas in budget reconciliation. Get rid of a lot of rules and regulations that add cost, that don't do anything to keep us safer. Just carrying out stupid things like banning gas stoves and banning the combustion engine. The EPA came out with a rule that is already killing thousands of jobs up in Michigan. Let's get rid of those rules that have no impact on our country. It helps China. If you want to, help the EV industry in China, that's what those rules do. They crush American jobs. We got to get rid of those rules too.
It's fairly actually a sort of conventional response, I suppose, as you maybe expect from legislative Republicans. Aaron, I thought, people want a Barney. Let's bring up last week's debate. We were talking about geoengineering. I think one thing this makes me think, Donald Trump's re-election, is that one, this seems to be because people really don't like spending more money on stuff, right? It does seem like potentially Kamala Harris's sort of previous opposition to fracking had done her a little bit of damage. I don't think it's the overriding issue, but people really don't like prices to go up. And sort of an impressive legislative agenda such as Biden had on climate to some degree can be sort of torn apart quite easily with a change of government, with an anti-climate backlash. And this is why I think it's not a safe bet to rely that we can make the politics work for climate, let alone do anything like taxing fish, which is why I feel like the technology is easier to fix than the politics when it comes to climate. And that's why we should be looking at techno fixes quite seriously. We won't have a 20-minute argument on this. Respond, then we'll wrap up.
Hopefully not. Well, so last week I suggested we have a Pigouvian tax on fish. Now, why would I suggest that? It's because we eat a food stuff, which is wild. That is crazy. We don't eat wild animals, with some exceptions, like, deer or whatever. We don't eat wild animals on land. The fact we're still eating wild animals in the seas is absolutely crazy. Now, I support working class politics. If you were to introduce a tax on wild caught fish, you would remove a tax from somewhere else. But anyway, we'll park that for a moment, Michael. And maybe people wouldn't mind that. If VAT was, 12%, but we have a new tax on fish or whatever, maybe that'd be popular. Let's do some polling. But anyway, that conversation is a really interesting one, and we can park it because it's absolutely enormous. In terms of climate politics, geoengineering, I actually think one of the curveballs of the Trump presidency now going forward is that we probably get geoengineering sooner than we would have, right? Because you have a ton of people around him, people like Peter Thiel, etc., who are quite supportive of geoengineering. So I think it's now very much a live issue on the policy agenda. It's not just a speculative thing for science fiction. If there was some kind of extreme weather event now that afflicted the United States, you would think, well, that will bolster the argument of people that are talking about climate change. Maybe it would, but I think more likely it would actually just accelerate efforts at geoengineering, which, by the way, could go very badly wrong. There's big upside, but there's also a really, really big downside, potentially. So I think the geoengineering thing is really fascinating, Michael. And on EVs, again, it goes back to my point earlier on about the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act, you're spending $270 billion to create very few jobs, but it was very important if you want to maintain US strategic leadership in technologies around computation, right? Hugely important. Also, if you're worried about losing Taiwan, you're going to need those microprocessor fab labs close to home. Again, it was about geopolitics and national security, right? But in terms of winning votes, not very smart. Similar with EVs, Michael. If you're basically saying, as the United States, we have a domestic market of 350 million people, we're not going to make EVs. We're just going to focus on fossil fuel cars. Short term, that's great. That is great to win votes. Of course it is. But then you're basically saying, well, you know what? There's a global market out there of 8 billion human beings. And whoever wants to buy a car, realistically, in the medium to long term, is going to want to buy an EV because they're going to be cheaper. Just are. Because of deflationary tendencies with renewable energy. And the US isn't going to be part of that. We are not going to be exporting cars en masse to developing markets, whether that's Indonesia or Nigeria or wherever, because we're fundamentally deploying a different, inferior kind of technology. That is not in America's long-term self-interest, national interest. But because China is not really a democracy, they can make policy choices which look at 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future. They don't have to worry about short-term political calculus of, oh my God, 2 years in the midterms, we're going to get smashed. So you're right. I think in liberal democracies, this means a huge challenge for environmental politics. Although I do think that circle can be squared. Going back to that Biden advert a few years ago where he had a car and he said, we made magnificent cars in this country, we can do it again. Why on earth can't they be EVs? Why can't we export them? You could be able to make that argument and I think successfully win over lots of people. The world now in terms of global trade and manufacturing is clearly moving into two zones, technologically two, maybe even two internets long term. One is the Chinese sphere of influence, one is the US sphere of influence. So the US is going to have to export a ton of technology, and we in this country are going to become more and more dependent on the US, right? Huawei, great example. Okay, we can't have 5G anymore. Who's going to make it? Well, the Americans can't make it, by the way, because of these industrial policy shortcomings over the last 40, 50 years. The people that can make it, actually the Europeans. It's Ericsson, it's Nokia. But EVs, well, if America's not making the EVs and European car manufacturers like Volkswagen can't really compete with the Chinese on cost, maybe Europe will make its own EVs. Right, it would require huge tariffs and a protected market. But otherwise, we'll just buy the Chinese ones. Or if it's not the Chinese ones, we'll buy the Japanese ones. We'll buy the Korean ones. So long term, the stuff that you're talking about with Trump, whether that's the CHIPS Act, whether it's EVs, probably not in their national interest. And that's true alongside the climate stuff as well. But that's just a problem for democracies. Sometimes you can't think long term. Keir Starmer, he's trying to think really long term on a few really important issues, right? And the Tories could punish him for it. But then again, I think Keir Starmer, I think the Labour government, as much as I've criticised them for many, many things, I do think they're smarter cookies than Kamala Harris and the people around her.
Well, I was reading actually that they sort of what they're taking from this is they have got all this long-term thinking, just like Biden did, but they're like the only things that are going to determine the next election are prices, the NHS, and immigration. And so anything that's not in those three issues, we are not going to spend much time on, which you can see why they've sort of inferred that. It is a little bit depressing in terms of I do think long-term solutions do really matter. It's interesting you said, about geoengineering that I hadn't actually had this thought yet, but I do think it will really be on the table. Yeah, you're right. The people who are around Donald Trump are quite into this. He's very into getting all the oil out of the ground. Obviously, this is not the vision of geoengineering I had. I think it needs to be transitionary while you get to net zero, which isn't necessarily how Donald Trump is going to go about it. But no, I agree with you. It probably will be on the agenda now that Trump has been elected president, which doesn't mean I welcome his return to the White House. We've talked a lot about America this week. We will give you a much more varied diet next week, but I couldn't really think about anything else this week than sort of looking at all this fascinating analysis of the presidential election and what might come next. It's been a privilege talking through it all with you, Aaron.
It's been a real pleasure, Michael. And again, my apologies for last week. They got rather heated. I think I was a bit sleep deprived with my 1-year-old daughter. This week, I'm feeling a lot better.
Well, there were lots of people in the
despite-
comments saying Michael keeps interrupting Aaron, and I was reading it. So he was interrupting me. But maybe this is how perceptions differ when it comes to these things. Let's wrap up there. We'll be back next week. Have a fantastic weekend. You've been watching Novara Live. Good night.